Friends, this has been a year. Just 1 year ago, Cantor Azu, Rabbi Boxman, and I stood in this empty sanctuary, celebrating Rosh Hashanah with an entirely virtual audience. Indeed, for the most of the last year, this holy space has been hollow, with clergy, a camera, and a congregation we could not see or hear. I, for one, gained a healthy dose of respect for the craft of those working in television and film. As lonely as that experience felt at times, isolated and distant from one another, I marveled at the notes that came in each week from viewers. You shared with us how much it meant to have community in that dark time. Our live stream was called a lifeline more than once, as we brought light and hope into each other's lives. Our feeling of being a community, our one family, lifted us through this pandemic. Our connections have their roots in our shared common narrative. Professor Peter Pitzela attributes a significant part of our identity to the stories that we heard at our grandfather's knee, saw in images and films, tales and books, events in history. Part of what it means to be a Jew, Pitzela explains, is to share the stories of our tradition, which define who we are. All those who belong to our congregation, those who are Jewish or Jewish adjacent, our non-Jewish partners and extended family, know the stories that shape us. From sitting around the Seder table and saying that we were once slaves in Egypt, to attending services, studying our tradition, and celebrating holidays at temple. We learn collective Jewish themes from our family histories, the stories of those who came to America seeking freedom from oppression, as well as memories of sacred rituals and life cycle moments. It is this shared collective memory and identity that enables us to feel a kinship whenever we meet a Jew, someone we feel we know and who knows us, even though we may have just met for the first time. While that sense of common identity pulled us through the darkness of the pandemic, I fear that we may be losing a vital aspect of our identity as it slips out of our story narrative. Israel. I heard it this summer at overnight camps, where movements like If Not Now have made Israel such a volatile topic among staff that it was easier for them to not talk about Israel at all than to deal with the tension it created. We see Israel disappearing from conversations among younger generations who are on college campuses and are made to feel uncomfortable when they reveal their Zionism. And lest you think this is just about the younger generations, Israel is disappearing from older generations as well in Jewish communities across North America. The trend is so alarming that the Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs issued an open letter to the American rabbinate last week, pleading with rabbis to speak about Israel at the High Holy Days, because some of my rabbinic colleagues won't even bring up Israel from the pulpit. It should shock us that the Jewish community is reluctant to talk about our homeland, the land that we pined for across 2 millennia, the safe haven that always welcomes Jews, and the place that is literally the focus of our prayers. Israel is an integral part of who we are. In our silence, we are failing to keep that part of our collective memory alive, and I fear what altering our collective identity will mean for our future. We need to overcome our fears that Israel divides us, take ownership over telling our story by talking about Israel, and learn to pass along our love for Israel from generation to generation. If we are to make Israel once more part of our story, then we start by confronting the reasons we have been avoiding it. One impediment is the perception that Israel is a politically divisive issue. This narrative has been fed by those seeking to capitalize on the polarization of American society. Like many of you, I receive frequent emails from individuals purporting to have evidence that only one American party truly supports Israel, and nothing could be further from the truth. Support for Israel exists across our political spectrum. Israel has been and remains one of the only bipartisan issues that almost all elected officials agree upon in Washington. Even today, in our hyper-polarized environment, Israel remains the issue that Democrats and Republicans both support wholeheartedly. This unequivocal support of Israel across the political divide is the consistent message of AIPAC and other mainstream Jewish organizations. Israeli and American governments both recognize the importance of their relationship. Just 2 weeks ago, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett came to Washington to meet with President Biden. The two discussed critical issues related to regional and global security, including Iran. And the results strengthened the enduring partnership, according to Israeli and American sources, between the United States and Israel, underscoring the United States' unwavering commitment to Israel's security. So friends, if you hold on to nothing else from today, rest assured that the relationship between Israel and the United States remains secure regardless of which party controls Congress or the White House. That said, I know that pressure still exists for many who feel they must measure their words carefully on Israel. These individuals fear harsh criticism from those who want to virtue signal their connection to Israel by viciously attacking anyone who dares contradict or disagree with the positions of the Israeli government. It is time for us to stop this ridiculous behavior. If the person who is speaking loves Israel, then there should be space for constructive and honest feedback. One need not mythologize the state of Israel. Israel is a real nation, not perfection. And there are government policies and choices that we may or may not agree with. As a rabbi, as a strong supporter of JNF, of AIPAC and Israel bonds, I am devoted to Israel. Yet there are times when I don't agree 100% with Israeli domestic policies. Clearly, I'm not alone, because within Israel itself, there are a vast array of opinions on Israel, as evidenced by the multiple elections it took just to create this current stable government. Israel and the American Jewish community are inextricably intertwined, and we have a stake in Israel. The Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Nachman Shai, welcomes the engagement of the American community and even our criticism, as he says that Israel needs American Jewish clarity and backbone to empower them to make the bold decisions that will ensure Israel's continuity as both a Jewish and a democratic state. Minister Shai sees American Jewish values as critical for helping Israel reach a two-state solution that, in his words, is the only solution for both our security and our soul. So if the government of Israel welcomes our diverse opinions and perspectives as American Jews, then there is no reason for Israel to be a reason for us to fight with each other. We can have civil and honest discourse around Israel where we leave open the option to agree to disagree about policies while still loving Israel. It's time to put down our verbal swords and spears and turn them into the instruments we need to plant the seeds for a united Jewish community around Israel. Having overcome our fears, we realize that we need to reclaim the conversation around Israel now more than ever. Every good story begins and ends with the speaker, because that individual's views and attitude set the tone for how the subject is going to be presented. In the absence of our voices talking about Israel, Aristotle's axiom that nature abhors a vacuum has proven true, as other speakers filled the void that we left. Among those individuals, a growing number portray Israel as an oppressive behemoth, an illegitimate nation whose very existence is an injustice. The boycott, divest, and sanction movement, BDS, as they are commonly known, turns a blind eye toward Palestinian terrorism and Arab complicity, while comparing the treatment of Palestinians with that of enslaved Africans in America in the imagery of the apartheid. They call Israelis colonialist interlopers, twisting the historical narrative and ignoring that Jews have been in the land for more than 3,000 years. These so-called voices for peace say that they only oppose Israel and Zionism. They will tell you that they are not anti-Semites or anti-Jews, and a greater falsehood could not be offered. BDS is outright anti-Semitism, and it needs to be called out as such. Anti-Semite is the right label for anyone who demonizes and delegitimizes Israel. Where are these voices on the human rights violations across China regarding Hong Kong or the Uyghurs? Why are they silent on the Taliban or the treatment of women and LGBT individuals in the West Bank and Middle East? I ask, have Unilever and Ben & Jerry's stopped selling products in all those countries too? We cannot allow BDS fanatics with their hidden anti-Semitism to present a warped version of Israel, any more than we would want ISIS to be telling the story of the United States. We need to be the ones talking about Israel, telling our own story. That is the only way to reclaim this piece of our identity and prevent others from desecrating our collective memory. While we embrace Israel once more as central to our story, we do wonder, how will we transmit our love for Israel to the next generation? Let's be honest. The repetitive waves of conflict, bloodshed, and rockets have left many feeling numb as that cycle repeats over and over again. Even more problematic are the gaps in perception between the generations. Older generations experienced Israel's founding, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, times when Israel's very existence hung in the balance. These generations think of Israel as a tiny nation. David, armed with his slingshot, fighting for its life against a veritable Goliath of assembled Arab armies. Israel is the place that we, the Jewish people, brought back to life, rising out of the ashes of the Holocaust. But that view differs greatly from many who grew up in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. To a segment of that population, Israel is Goliath, a Western-style democracy with far more wealth, access to education, and a higher standard of living than all of its Arab neighbors. Many from this age demographic struggle to relate to the stories that we tell of Israel as the proverbial underdog, because it flies in the face of what they know. Now, before you start to argue with me and say, but Rabbi, it's the truth. Israel has been and will be David. The truthfulness of the statements is not relevant. Perception is reality. And for many younger Jews, the language and message of Israel that we have been using for so long just does not resonate with them. We need to rethink the way that we talk about Israel, moving our language away from the wearisome conflict narrative while crafting a message that will resonate across the generations. We find inspiration from a story of marketing genius. What is a diamond? It is carbon compressed over time to create the beautiful jewels that we cherish. Diamonds are sold by many companies, but it was De Beers who created a plot twist that convinced the market to buy diamonds even at a huge premium. In 1916, De Beers revealed perhaps the best advertising slogan of the 20th century: a diamond is forever. In this marketing strategy, De Beers wove a story that portrayed diamonds as a symbol of love and commitment, soon enough everyone around the world would expect nothing less than a De Beers diamond ring from their partner. It's time for Israel to sparkle with a new brand of its own, one that will engage and reinvigorate younger generations, while symbolizing our commitment to keeping Israel in our hearts. We reframe our story about the many facets of Israel around the phrase, Israel is forever. It's time for us to talk about Israel is forever, a place of innovation. The quintessential startup nation constantly pushing the boundaries of technology, medical research, and treatment, as well as home to many things like instant messaging that we take for granted. During the pandemic, Israel embraced the new vaccine technology, vaccinating at a rate faster than any other nation. We should be sharing that Israel is forever there to help those who are in need. From the 1980s, when Israel welcomed Vietnamese refugees who could not find a home anywhere else, to today, when Israel is the first nation to respond to every crisis around the world. In the wake of every earthquake, flood, and hurricane, Israeli disaster rescue personnel arrive on the scene, ready to provide their expertise and medical and recovery assistance. We should be celebrating that Israel is forever, a nation invested in equality and justice for all. Israeli Arabs are full Israeli citizens and members of the government. Israel's new government is committed to increasing gender equality at the Kotel and religious pluralism. And while many of the countries around Israel still perform corporal punishment on those who identify as LGBT, Tel Aviv is home to one of the largest pride parades in the whole world. And we should take heart, knowing that whatever challenges exist, Israel is forever evolving, changing, and growing in surprising and often unanticipated directions. Who could have imagined that Prime Minister Begin would negotiate with President Sadat to create lasting peace with Egypt? That Rabin and Arafat would sit down at the same table with each other? Or the very recent reconnection with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and other nations that once called Israel a sworn enemy and now engage in tourism and commerce. Friends, we made it through the darkest hours, knowing that we were not alone. We were part of something bigger than ourselves. Now, in this year of 5782, pledge to keep our collective identity strong, end the silence, and make Israel once more part of our collective story. Please talk about Israel with your friends and your family, your children and grandchildren. Make it clear that Israel is forever part of who we are, part of our memory, part of our identity. It is now our task to ensure that Lador Vador, from one generation to the next, Israel is forever. That we will always have our connections to keep us strong and to give us hope whenever the darkness comes. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May Israel be forever, and may it be God's will. Amen.